Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be covering part 2 on a 3-part series of the precession of the equinoxes. And so basically, in part 1, we discussed how this was a very important science to ancient cultures. And what we're going to be covering today is, was this also important to ancient Israel? Is it reflected in both the Old and New Testaments? And so we mentioned in part 1, we talked about ancient Egypt, we talked about the ancient Meso and Native American cultures in North America, how it might have been reflected in their beliefs, ancient India. But was this a thing of Israel, and can we find it in the Bible? Well, basically, just to reflect some of the importance of this science, it's mentioned in several takes in the Old Testament. Starting with Genesis chapter 1, it says that the stars were given for signs in seasons. We had talked about the sons of Issachar and how they understood the times and knew what to do. Chapter 7 in Daniel, Daniel was made chief of the wise men, or the magi, or the astrologers. It's mentioned in several psalms about the signs in the heavens and whatnot. And also, when you actually look at ancient Israel itself, there were 12 tribes of Israel reflected with the 12 zodiacs. And how do we know that? Well, if you look at how their camp was actually set up geographically in Numbers chapter 2, you had Judah, Reuben, Dan, and Ephraim. Okay, and if you look at how these were described, they were put at the four corners of the earth, on all four sides of the camp. And if you look at how they are actually described in Genesis 49, when there's a blessing given over them, Judah is described as like a lion, he crouches down. Reuben is described as turbulent like the waters. Dan is like a serpent in the way, which again, the serpent is often associated with either Scorpio or the eagle, is kind of different looks of that specific constellation. And Ephraim is described as a firstborn bull. So basically what we have there is Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aquarius, which is a four corners of the earth. And that's how they're set up in ancient Israel. Now, when you actually, if you're not sold on that, if you look at when Balaam was convinced to curse the tribe of Israel, he went up on high and he went up in the mountain and looked down on the camp of Israel. And we know the story that he doesn't end up cursing them. He actually blesses them. And he says the same exact description in the blessing, even more specifically. Again, he describes Judah as being like a lion. He describes Reuben, in this case, he says he will pour out buckets of water, which is even more of an Aquarian reference. He describes, again, Ephraim like a bull. And then there's no description of Dan, because there's kind of like a joke played on him. He's actually standing on the same side as Dan, as the serpent. So it's kind of like a interesting play on words there. So that is really how it's reflected in the Old Testament, that this was something important. Okay, and then when we move into the New Testament, was this a thing also in the New Testament? So first off, if you actually look at the illuminated manuscripts, the book of Kells, the very Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you look at the cover, they are actually, again, the four living creatures, okay? It is a man, lion, the bull, and the eagle, and it's right on the cover of the illuminated manuscripts. We know that the magi, or the wise men that came watching the star and looking for Jesus, looking for Messiah, that they followed this science, and they were actually Zoroastrian priests, but they were aware of the science as well. And so lastly, we're going to be looking at Jesus, and was this actually reflected in something that he talked about in possibly Matthew 24? Okay, so there are some references. Again, it's the possibility, was Jesus actually talking about this processionally when we look at the eschatology and the apocalypse? And, there's so many different views on eschatology. I'm not claiming that this is the only one. I've looked at several of them, and there's not any that I'm totally convinced that's the way it is. But I have seen in certain parts and places that, I believe that makes sense. I do believe a lot was fulfilled with eschatology, with the collapse of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the Roman diaspora started. I do believe that a lot of that was fulfilled, but I also believe that there is more. There's more unbudding and being fulfilled and all of that. So the thing I found interesting is some of the wording that Jesus uses in Matthew 24. So first off, he talked about in the days of Noah. And so again, if you've seen the part 1 of this, we talked about how a site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, which is very close to Mount Ararat, where the ark was described as landing. There's a time capsule basically buried that might reflect that time period in the star alignments with how they are looking in the 21st century. Now, how do we know that? There's actually a computer software that you can get in which you can rewind as far back as you want to go, and you will know exactly where the stars were in the sky at a before Christ date, whenever. And you can also fast forward as far as you want forward and see exactly what the stars are going to look like, because it's such a documented science. And so was that a reference again to the times that we are going into now, which happen to be at another precessional switch? And so he mentions it will be like the days of Noah, and he gives some other descriptions, but was he also reflecting to a precessional switch that we're going to be that we are going through in the 21st century? Another interesting piece of wording that he uses is when he says 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will remain. Okay, now taken at face value, that a lot of people have gotten like more of like a rapture reference from that. The thing that I found interesting as I studied ancient cultures is that is actually precessional vocabulary. The grinding of the mill is described as the zodiacs, again, that switch with that slow precession. It's known in some cultures as the grinding of the mill, the churning of the milky waters. There was all these terminologies for it. There's actually a book written called Hamlet's Mill, where it shows how a lot of ancient cultures described the precessional science within their ancient texts and through numerology and all of that as well. But it's precessional language. So again, when Jesus is talking about 2 women grinding at the mill, is he talking about that precessional switch? We know that he refers to a lot of other things, as well as astrological signs in the heavens and stuff that's going to be taking place. So is this a possibility that Jesus is referring to precessional switch? So basically, we're going to be talking about this more in the last installment, part 3, which is the most important installment, where we talk about this precessional switch that's taking place and what are the characteristics of that? What is that going to look like? Do humans have a responsibility? Are they going to be participating in that switch? And so that's just a little bit about how this is reflected in the Bible today. And next time we're going to be looking at the importance of this switch, which is, again, the most important installment. So I hope you follow along. I hope you catch this last video. Y'all take care.